and science can keep imagining the future, and we will be outside afterwards, critique it, or like constantly problematize it. I think that's the problem. So denying philosophers to do that, or denying the category of politics to do that, and allowing the market, or like even the science to do that, this whole separation, sort of like allowing the scientific image to do it while the other one will critique it. So I think it's not like they completely reject it, it's just that it's been outsourced to the bad people who are good at doing the bad stuff, and the good people will do the good stuff, which is the critique.
Who's outsourced you mean the...
So like the Western Marxism after World War II, sort of like this, I mean, I could be like wrong, but I'm just suggesting that like could be this type of like unwritten agreement that like that the task of imagining future is outsourced to the capital and to maybe science, which is funded by capital, and then the task of the philosopher or like the critic is to look at what's being done and constantly problematize it and critique it rather than participate in imagining the future.
Yeah, but I mean, I'd say, I guess the one, yes, I mean, I think the pro... Okay, look, I mean, there's a kind of, like you get this kind of thing, the prohibition on any positive characterization of utopia in kind of late Adorno is, I think that's understandable. In other words, he doesn't want to, what I admire about Adorno is his resistance, his kind of resistance to the lure of false reconciliation. And what's good about Adorno is the claims that, we shouldn't, reconciliation is always deception, okay? So like, the point about affirming the unreconcilable. But it seems to me that there's a kind of resignation, which is itself a kind of reconciliation. You reconcile yourself to the unreconcilable by saying there's nothing to be done. And saying there's nothing to be done, and if you try to do anything, you'll just bring about the worst, is it's tragic resignation, which is just another, it might be a ethically superior form of reconciliation, but I don't want to be reconciled. I don't believe in reconciliation, which is why I'm interested in, reactivating this program of practice, because otherwise it's too easy to kind of, you disrupt the danger of reconciliation by reopening some kind of possibility of some kind of, intervention, however kind of dangerous and kind of problematic it might be.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question about the relationship between Marxism, or actually Marx, and Prometheanism. And I wonder to what extent the theme of Prometheanism is determined by its, obviously it is historically, but by its antagonism to a particular form of abstract domination, which is religion. Mm-hmm. So, hypothetically, I think it would be possible to somewhat periodize Marx's own relationship to the question of Prometheanism in a way that builds on what you've said, but might render it a little more complex. So if you take the Prometheanism of the very early Marx as being in a mold of fairly straightforwardly radical Enlightenment, young Hegelianism, and so on, then I think the question becomes very peculiar when you pass from the criticism of heaven to the criticism of the earth, and you have the manifesto, where of course the subject of Prometheanism is the bourgeoisie. That's where you already get this very peculiar ambivalence. The one subject which up to now has mutated, transformed the world, is not clearly the working class. It's not species being or humanity as such. It is this, world-oriented agent. By the later Marx, that's dropped out as well, because actually the bourgeoisie is a fairly miserable and fractious entity, and therefore it becomes, to an extent, capital as a automatic subject. That's the, so when you get to the Grundrisse, the concentration of science, the transformation of the world is not, of course it's based on the theft of labor and theft of workers' knowledge and so on, but the subject is, the subject of that transformation is in a sense, in a complex sense, capital. And that puts Prometheanism in a kind of a bind, because you're not simply trying to undo the abstract domination of a force like religion or the state or politics for the sake of human knowledge. You're stuck in the dialectical recognition that the subject of world transformation is in a complex and, and as a complex manner, the alienation of people's work itself, which then, has put a lot of Marxists in a bind, because of course, it has put Marx himself in a bind, because then it's like, but, the great works of humankind end up being also simply the byproducts, the excrescences of capital's logic of accumulation. They're not because human beings have, reached for the stars and for enlightenment. So I was wondering what you thought about that, because I think it's quite complex mode. And then the second thing is just a bit of a corollary, because I know you're very interested in the work of Sebastiano Timpanaro, and I wonder if there isn't a different lineage, not maybe anti-Prometheanism is probably not the right term, but a way of criticizing a certain conception of infinite mastery or what have you, without referring to finitude in a Kantian Heideggerian transcendental sense, but in a much more naturalist sense. So Timpanaro's sort of pessimistic Leopardi meets Marx naturalism is something, for me, I don't necessarily find it entirely persuasive, but it's something I think is quite different than that Dupuy line. And it's a kind of ancient Greek materialist and very Enlightenment inspired. So I was wondering what you thought about that other.
Okay. Well, regarding the first question, this involves like having to kind of, confront all these, sophisticated accounts of like, the fact that, capitalism's status as this kind of, well, is it that you wouldn't, you're not going to want to say that capitalism is a subject of history, but it has become this kind of, the motive force of contemporary. Like it's no longer kind of, the motive force is no longer associated or kind of at the level of, anything that, it's as if human beings have relinquished their kind of, practical and kind of, their agency to some level to the agency of this kind of abstract, machinery that, and that's, obviously that's correct, okay, and that needs to be, and I think, that's the biggest challenge to this reassertion of Prometheanism, is the claim that, well, what if it's too late? What if there's, what if there's kind of, the conditions, the social and historical conditions under which some kind of transformative praxis, could be elaborated are just not available anymore. And I acknowledge, the kind of the accuracy. I take this stuff very, very seriously, and it's stuff I need to kind of engage with. And I don't have right now I don't have a kind of a response to it. But it seems to me that there's a problem. What becomes of Marxism as kind of, famous, if I do think you have to be careful about recognizing kind of the complicated dynamic between kind of system, kind of, systemic agency and the kind of the, agency at the kind of the human level. If there's a complete or radical dissociation, and if capitalism is the only subject, if capitalism is now the transcendental subject, then obviously there's not much, then it seems to me that, the danger is kind of melancholy, defeatism. All you can do is expose this, okay? But it seems to me it's very but then what has become of, the kind of the connection between theory and practice, the claim that thinking is itself a kind of activity? Because once you've diagnosed the fact that, this machinery is now so powerful, so all-consuming, that there's no room for us to kind of, and which is actually true. This is why, the rejoinder to any kind of naive kind of voluntarism or spontaneous, is necessary. But I think it can't be used. I mean, the problem, I think, is the problem of subjectivation. If the proletariat is no longer kind of, it seems incredible to try to kind of, characterize the proletariat as the kind of, the locus of kind of human species being, which will kind of, challenge the hegemony of capitalism, then, you need to kind of, well, I mean, maybe you don't, but it seems to me that you would need to kind of, if you try to kind of come up with an alternative account of subjectivation. And this is what I'm really interested in, the relationship between system and subject, between capitalism as a system and subjectivity, but without one that doesn't kind of simply say, it's the proletariat, but neither does it simply say, does it kind of say, well, they're just these, but I don't want to accept an evental account, where they're just these evental. And so I don't have a theory of the subjects, but I think you need one for emancipatory politics. And I think the weakness of this kind of systemic analysis is that, or no, it's not a weakness, it's not an analytical weakness, it's an incredibly powerful analytical system. But then, as you know, it can also kind of accommodate itself to a kind of a politics of a very dubious, logic. Well, this is the best we can hope for, and just a quick word about the second question, which was about. Sorry, just remind me what this. Timpanaro. Yeah, I love Timpanaro, but the thing, I'm more of an idealist than he is. That doesn't mean to say I'm not a materialist. I'm an idealist because I really like thinking, and I'm interested in the possibility that there's more things to think and discover, which is why. There's a kind of, again, I mean, I respect, there's a kind of really admirable kind of pessimism, materialist pessimism. But again, I'm very wary of the lure of resignation. And I'm unwilling to resign myself to anything where I suspect that, well, maybe there's more to discover about this, or we don't quite, the facts of the matter are not all in about this. And about our biological nature, I think that is particularly true. So,
I just wanted to pick up, I guess, on this question of a set of somewhat unspoken, I think, sort of co-locations that are here, which have to do with the relation between a sort of resignation, a historical period, which you could call something like Western Marxism, or a certain term, and then the question, let's say, of relatively complicated scientific practice, understood also as things that only capital funds. And this is a problem that I find in a lot of that stuff that people want to talk about as accelerationism, which I find crap, totally. And I find it crap for a number of reasons, but one of which is that it basically, it sets up a false link between a certain form of the resignation of, so to say, Promethean processes, right, with negativity. And then on the other hand, it has something like, if we intervene, it'll look like social democracy, right? And it's kind of sounding like a TED talk to become stewards of advanced processes of capital, which is alarmingly unaware of ongoing critiques of technological objectivism. You get this in the Italian tradition, you get this much earlier in terms of Luxemburg's critique of Bernstein, etc. And what it misses is that you could imagine a Promethean labor of negation that has nothing to do with resignation, but a way to understand the tradition of, let's say, Western Marxism you were grasping. I mean, all the thinkers seeing this moment, this seeming kind of closure, the tautology of capital to itself, which is a material process, what they're recognizing is simply that it's harder and harder to fathom building a counter system within the same space of the built world, because you can't separate, so to say, the abstractions of capital from its material edifices. So while there's, we have an Adornian take on the one hand, you can also imagine another tradition that says that what we've hit is a moment where Promethean labor will not be that of the development of more productive forces, but a profoundly creative and massively organized process of the dismantling of that world towards other ends.
Okay.
So I just want to stress that I think there's sometimes a false association with something like a very rationally directed hostility and antagonism towards capital, which is important. There's often an automatic link between that and certain forms of nanotech, biotech, etc. And I think this misses the fact that we need to understand that you could equally fathom a Promethean work of very serious disruption of, let's say, flows of capital and the further kind of filling of the world. So that's...
Okay. So I'm not suggesting that simply kind